Welcome to this Dharma discussion with SVT. And we'll start today with Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Welcome to this meeting, and today we're going to look at Sutta Majjhima Nikaya number 19, the two kinds of thought. And this is a really helpful sutta for our personal practice. And when we're looking at two kinds of thought, it's basically what is the balance? The balance between unwholesome ways of thinking, and from thought comes speech and action, and wholesome ways of thinking, from which again, speech and action come about. So, the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's Park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my enlightenment, so this is whilst the Buddha was a bodhisattva, while I was still an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I sat on one side. I set on one side thoughts of sensual desire, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty. So what's important to recognize here is that even as a bodhisattva, the Buddha had thoughts of desire, sensual desire, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty as he was developing. And I was set on the other side, thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. So, what are thoughts of renunciation? What is it that's being renounced? And we often have a difficult relationship with this word renunciation. We often think of it in negative terms, in terms of suppression or restriction or limitation, or giving up something that we would enjoy. But the Buddha had a different take on renunciation. His take on renunciation was very much about renouncing the things that cause suffering. So what is it that we renounce? We renounce things that create an unwholesome state of mind. And it's the unwholesome state of mind that creates the suffering. And so what creates an unwholesome state of mind? Well, taking any sensory desire personally. As soon as we personalize that, then we set ourselves up to experience dukkha. As soon as we identify with experience, we make it part of us, part of me, mine or my own. Then we have an opinion and a preference about whether it stays or goes. Those things we're attracted to, we want them to stay and not go. And so their impermanence causes us suffering. And those things that we don't like, we have an aversion reaction towards, and we suffer whilst they're there. And there's a lovely little reference to renunciation in the Anguttara Nikaya, and this is in the Book of the Fives, and it's sort of 200. And it's entitled The Escape. And bhikkhus, there are these 5 elements of escape. What 5? Here, when a bhikkhu is attending upon sensory pleasures, his mind does not launch out upon them and become placid, settled, focused on them. But when he's attending to renunciation, his mind launches out upon it and becomes placid, settled, and focused on it. So instead of launching out onto the sensory pleasures, his mind launches out onto renunciation. When that happens, his mind is well departed, well developed, well emerged, well liberated, well detached from sensual pleasures. Well, what's important to recognize here is that then what we're talking about here is the mind is not brought up with the sensual pleasure. Renunciation is not saying that some sensory experiences cannot be pleasurable. No, absolutely. Feeling says, Nibanna says, the experience can be pleasant, it can be unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. What matters is what happens next. And does our mind launch out upon this experience? And if it does, then that's the attachment that we're talking about here. It's that process of launching out upon this experience. That's what the Buddha is inviting us to renounce. Not all possible sensory pleasures, because we're not in control of that. That depends on contact. When contact arises, that sets up the conditions for feeling to arise. And feeling can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. And that is not under our control. So we shouldn't seek to control it. We shouldn't try to banish all pleasurable sensation, just simply as we shouldn't try to banish all unpleasant sensation. But it's whether we launch out onto it, upon it, or not. And so what the Buddha is saying is, if you're going to, launch out upon it, what you need to launch out and upon is renunciation. And if we do that, then our mind becomes placid, settled, and focused. And the mind becomes well departed, well developed, well emerged, well liberated, and well detached from these sensory pleasures. So we can experience them without the holding on. And when we're free of that, those attachments, those mechanisms that are distressful and feverish of the mind, as the Buddha would describe it, then we don't feel that kind of feeling of that feverishness and distress. And that is the escape from sensual pleasures. So what are the 5 elements of escape? Escape from sensual pleasures, escape from ill will, escape from harming, escape from form, and escape from this personal identity with existence. All of these are things that create dukkha. So if we go back to the original sutta here, when I set aside thoughts of sensual desire, the Buddha says, thoughts of ill will and thoughts of cruelty, and I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty, he's defining these 2 kinds of thoughts. So thoughts of renunciation we've just looked at. What are thoughts of non-ill will? Well, that's central to the whole of the twin practice, because thoughts of non-ill will just needs to be turned around to thoughts of loving kindness. Loving kindness is the antidote to ill will. And what are thoughts of non-cruelty? Well, again, if we turn that round, instead of thoughts of not something, we can define that as thoughts of compassion. Because compassion is the antidote to cruelty. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute. Diligent, ardent, and resolute. Well, diligent means, being careful about what I'm doing. Ardent means I have an energetic engagement with wanting to do this. And resolute, this is the persistence. And these are the characteristics we need to develop for our practice. We need to be diligent, ardent, and resolute. So the Buddha says, as I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. So even as a bodhisattva, the sensual desire arose. This thought of so I understood thus, this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction. So it creates dukkha in me. It creates dukkha in others. And the affliction of both of us, myself and others. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibanna. So why does it obstruct wisdom? Well, whenever the Buddha mentions wisdom, Bhante Viramansi always used to say, the reference here is to dependent origination. So once we get caught up in desire, we don't see the links of dependent origination. We're lost in craving. That produces the story about why I like or don't like this, and then that produces the habitual responses. And then we get into papancha, which is this proliferation of thought, and we're suddenly in a whole different vortex of thinking and reacting, which has taken us away from awareness. So when I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the affliction of both, it subsided in me. So this, I think, is a very useful sentence. When we bring awareness to the process of creating dukkha, when we see the craving creates dukkha, then a natural process begins to happen. And the natural process is that we cut off the energy that's doing that. But we have to see it. Okay? So the first stage of seeing it is to reflect. And this is when I considered this leads to my own affliction. That's the stepping back from being involved in the actual activity itself and beginning to see it objectively rather than being lost in the subjective experience. As soon as we begin to do that, if we have a practice that is diligent, ardent, and resolute, we will see the causal links that have got us there. We will see how we took something personally. And as soon as we see that, we cut off the energy for that reaction and it subsides. And when I considered that when these things arise, they obstruct wisdom, cause difficulties, and leads us away from Nibanna, it subsided in me. So here's the reflective awareness of the consequences of engaging, launching out upon the sensory experience. This is the process of renunciating. And when we renunciate, it subsides. So, in the swim practice, this renunciation is quite simply expressed through the 6 R's. That is the power and beauty of Bhante Viramsa's swim meditation. 6 R's are right effort. They are the foundation stone of our practice. And when I considered thus, this leads to the affliction of both. It subsided in me. And when I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulty, and leads away from Nibanna, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of desire arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. Not by force, but by right effort. So this isn't a suppression. And the temptation sometimes is to suppress. But that's not what Bhante Viramsa was talking about in his teaching. He said, no, don't suppress. Because as soon as you can't suppress anymore, it will just come flooding back. What you need is understanding. And in this paragraph, we see the understanding. We consider, this is the investigation. It's one of the enlightenment factors, investigation, to see what is going on. And the consequence of that investigation is that we cut off the fuel, we use the 6 R's, and it subsides. The more often we do this, the more familiar we will become with this process, and the more automatic it will be. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of ill will arose in me. So we've had sensual desires, now we have ill will. And it's the same process. We recognize that this is for our own affliction, and for the affliction of others, and for the affliction of both of us. And when we recognize that, that gives us the space. Apply right effort, 6 R's, and that takes the fuel away. So not only for sensual desires, but for ill will, for cruelty. And when we do this, we see ill will and we see cruelty. And by working in this way, we see how to abandon it, to remove it, and do away with it. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. Now, the mind here is not the intellectual mind, Nibanna, it's chitta. Chitta is the heart mind, if you like. It's the seat of the emotions. It's where intention is formulated and expressed. Intention in Pali is chaitana. Chaitana, the root of the word chaitana is, again, chitta. So it's an important recognition that this is a felt place. So whatever we think and ponder upon becomes the inclination of our mind. And inclination, I think, is a very useful thinking. It means that the mind leans in to this. So we have to consciously do something so the mind doesn't lean in, if what we're leaning into is unwholesome. But when we 6 R, we're training our mind to lean towards the wholesome. Whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. If they frequently think and ponder upon thoughts of sensual desire, the consequence of that is the abandoning of thoughts of renunciation. So they've abandoned the thought of renunciation to cultivate the thought of sensual desire. The two can't be in the mind at the same time. And then their mind inclines towards thoughts of sensual desire. So that's the stickiness of the I like it mind. If they frequently think and ponder upon thoughts of ill will, same thing happens. Right? The mind inclines towards thoughts of cruelty. And so they've abandoned thoughts of non-cruelty, compassion. If we abandon thoughts of ill will, we've abandoned thoughts of loving kindness. And so our mind then inclines towards ill will, or it inclines towards cruelty. And so this is where the effort is needed. We need to make the conscious choice to do something different. And that's expressed through the 6 R's. Just as in the last month of the rainy season, in the autumn, when the crops thicken, a cowherd would guard his cows by constantly tapping and poking them on the side, on one side and then the other, with a stick to check and curb them. Why is that? Because he sees that he could be flogged, imprisoned, fined, or blamed if he let the cows stray into the crops. So too, this is the Buddha speaking, saw in unwholesome states danger, degradation, and defilement, and in wholesome states, the blessing of renunciation and the aspect of cleansing of the mind. So, if we don't watch the cows constantly, they'll soon be in the crops, the young crops eating them, and the crops won't develop. So, at this early stage of the practice, we need this constant vigilance. And if you remember how the practice was described as diligent, ardent, and resolute, this is the diligence. We need to be constantly aware of where our mind and how our mind moves. Not in a stressful way, but in a curious and open way, so that we're constantly learning how our mind behaves and what we need to do about it. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of renunciation arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of renunciation has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, does not cause difficulties, which are the hindrances, and leads to Nibanna. If I think and ponder upon this thought, even for a night, even for a day, even for a day and a night, I see nothing to fear from it. So thoughts about renunciation do not if you like, lead us astray. But with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body, and when my body is tired, my mind becomes strained. And when my mind is strained, it is far from collectedness. So here we have another expression of the limitation, if you like, of speculative thinking. Keep thinking around things, chewing them over in the mind. We need to move beyond this thinking to staying with the felt experience of the practice. Because the felt experience of the practice does not exhaust us in the same way as lots of speculative analysis. So investigation has its place, but we don't want investigation to become the practice. It's a supporting element through the practice of enlightenment. But we want to continue to practice with this soft, open awareness that Bhante Viramansi described, which allows us to, if you like, relax into this objective awareness of what's going on. So I steadied my mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness and collectedness. Now, the singleness, this is ekagata, and it's often described as one-pointedness. But that tends to create an image in the mind of excessive focus. And again, this has a sense of strain about it, as we might think classically about concentration. So if we're doing an exam and we felt, got to concentrate, it's tightness. But it's more, rather than this single pointedness, it's much more, or another description is unification of mind. So this oneness of mind, this unification. And when we're used to working with a collected form of concentration, then we don't have this narrow perspective. We have a much wider one. And as our meditation practice develops, it's this wider vision in which the understanding comes. We open up our peripheral vision. So we have this soft, expansive awareness rather than this closed, narrow focus. So why do I develop this, the Buddha said? Why is that? So that my mind should not be strained. So we're looking to develop a state of mind that doesn't have that sense of strain about it. And that sense of strain can become from too much investigation, even though we're investigating things which are essentially for our good. And it can come from too much focus and concentration. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of non-ill will arose in me. So remember, non-ill will, loving kindness. A thought of non-cruelty arose in me. This is compassion. I understood thus. This thought of non-cruelty has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction, or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, does not cause difficulties, and leads to Nibanna. If I think and ponder upon this thought, even for a night, even for a day, even for a night and day, I see nothing to fear from it. But with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body. And when the body is tired, the mind becomes strained. And when the mind becomes strained, it is far from collectedness. So I steadied my mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness, this unification, and collected it. Why is that? So that my mind should not be strained. So even with the Brahma Viharas, ill will is counterbalanced by loving kindness. Cruelty is counterbalanced by compassion. But we don't make the compassion and the loving kindness the focus of our practice. Because if we do, our mind will become strained. No, it's the anchor for which we return. But remember, even with the Brahma Viharas, what we're interested in is what takes us away. It's the movements of mind. We're not looking to become absorbed into the loving kindness or absorbed into the compassion. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. If they frequently think and ponder upon thoughts of renunciation, they have abandoned the thought of sensual desire. So, inclining the mind towards renunciation. And remember, it's not a suppression, because suppressing would strain the mind again. And then their mind inclines towards thoughts of renunciation. If they frequently think and ponder on thoughts of non-ill will, this is compassion. Non-ill will, this is loving kindness, or thoughts upon non-cruelty, this is compassion. They have abandoned the thoughts of ill will and cruelty to cultivate the thought of non-ill will and non-cruelty, loving kindness and compassion. And then their mind inclines towards non-ill will and non-cruelty. In other words, towards loving kindness and towards compassion. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops have been brought inside the villages, a cowherd would guard his cows while staying at the root of a tree or out in the open, since he needs only to be mindful that the cows are there. So too, there was need for me only to be mindful that those states were there. So we've moved away from being this constantly diligent, looking for any movement of the mind, and then applying right effort. And as our practice develops, then it becomes a much more spacious practice. And we're simply observing what's going on. We simply need to know that the cows are there. We simply need to know that we are aware, we are mindful of a state of compassion or state of loving kindness. As a consequence of that, tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled, with my mind concentrated and unified. So collected and unified. So here we have the factors of enlightenment. Tireless energy. Energy is a factor of enlightenment. Unremitting mindfulness, a factor of enlightenment. My body was tranquil, factor of enlightenment. My body was concentrated, so collected, a factor of enlightenment. So here, the factors of enlightenment are coming together. What we're discovering here is this interconnection between the factors of enlightenment, the Eightfold Path, the path of practice. They're all interconnected. The factors of enlightenment are present in the 6 R's. The Four Noble Truths are present in the 6 R's. The Eightfold Path is present in the 6 R's. So we see this interconnection between the practice. Quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana. Just need to reference a previous sutta to get the full description of this. I entered upon and abided in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So these are the factors of jhanas. Vitakka vichara, this activity of the verbalized mind, if you like, and rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. So rapture here is piti, pleasure is sukha. With the stilling of the verbalized mind. So this is moving into second jhana. So the applied and sustained thought, or the investigation, the initial thought and investigation, they're stilled. So they begin to drop away. So if you like, they're renounced in the same way. And I entered upon and abided in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and this unification of mind, and doesn't have this verbalized aspect of the mind. So this is where noble silence begins in the practice. And it's also accompanied with rapture, that's piti, and pleasure born of collectedness. So here's another aspect of renunciation, which is as our practice develops, renunciation comes about as a consequence of the practice. So we can start off with renunciation as, if you like, expressed perhaps through the precepts about choosing how to behave in certain circumstances and how not to behave. But as our practice develops, aspects of our practice begin to drop away automatically. With the fading away as well of piti, of rapture. So this is it's sort of effusive joyfulness. I abided in equanimity and mindful and fully aware. Still feeling pleasure with the body. So we still have awareness of the physical body at this stage, but it's not causing us distress. I entered upon and abided in the third jhana, on account of which the noble ones announce, he has a pleasant abiding who has equanimity and is mindful. So here's an example, in jhana of a state which is pleasant. And the Buddha isn't saying you mustn't experience this, but we have to be careful not to launch out and hold on to the experience of the jhanas, because this will interrupt our practice. Simply enough to know that this is a pleasant state, that the body feels very comfortable, we feel a great sense of ease, a sense of contentment, and there's a settledness around what we're doing. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain. So this is sukha, but also dukkha. And with the previous disappearance of joy and grief. I entered upon and abided in the fourth jhana, which is neither pain nor pleasure, and has purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. So here equanimity has become supreme, if you like. And each of these stages are stages of cessation or stages of renunciation. But they're a natural progress as our practice develops. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, yes, we come through with the purity of mindfulness due to equanimity. When my concentrated mind, that's the collected mind, was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability. So imperturbability is a phrase which is very much allied to the awareness of equanimity and fourth jhana. I directed it to knowledge of the recollection of past lives. I recollected my manifold past lives, that is 1 birth, 2 births, 3 births, 4 births, 5 births, 10 births, 20 births, 30 births, 40 births, 50 births, 100 births, 1,000 births, 100,000 births, many eons of world contraction, many eons of world expansion, many eons of world contraction and expansion. There I was so named, of such a plan, with such an appearance, and such was my nutriment, such was my experience of pleasure and pain, such was my life term. And passing away from there, I reappeared elsewhere. And there too, I was so named, of such a plan, with such an appearance, such was my nutriment, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such my life term, and passing away from there, I reappeared here. Thus, with their aspects and particulars, I recollected my manifold past lives. So this is the verification of rebirth. This was the first true knowledge attained by me in the first watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose, darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. So still those same characteristics of the practice. When my concentrated mind, or this collected mind, as Bhante would say, was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, in other words, in fourth jhana, and we can think of the arupa jhanas and aspects of fourth jhana. I directed it to knowledge, the passing away and reappearance of beings. With the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. I understood how beings pass on according to their actions thus. These worthy beings who were ill conducted in body, speech, and mind, revilers of noble ones, wrong in their views, giving effect to wrong view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death, have reappeared in a state of deprivation, in a bad destination, in perdition, even in hell. But these worthy ones who are well conducted in body, speech, and mind, not revilers of noble ones, right in their views, giving effect to right view in their actions, on the dissolution of the body after death, have reappeared in a good destination, even in the heavenly world. Thus, with the divine eye, which is purified and surpasses the human, I saw beings passing away and reappearing, inferior and superior, fair and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. And I understood how beings pass on according to their actions. So this is the verification of the role of karma action in the nature of experience. Not only did he see it for himself as an individual, but then saw it as a universal truth for all people. This was the second true knowledge attained by me in the middle watch of the night. Ignorance was banished and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. When my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldly, steady, and attained imperturbability. So these are qualities of the collected mind. I directed it to knowledge of the destruction of the taints. And the taints, these are the asavas. They're the deep obsessions of the mind. So much more deeper than our habitual responses and our beliefs and our attitudes and our preferences. The asavas underlie the very essence of our existence and our attitude. I directed to the knowledge of the asavas. I directly knew as it really is. This is suffering. I directly knew as it really is. This is the origin of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the cessation of suffering. And I directly knew as it actually is. This is the way to the cessation of suffering. So that is verification of the Four Noble Truths. I directly knew these are the taints. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the origin of the taints. I directly knew as it actually is. This is the cessation of the taints. And I directly knew as it actually is. This is the way leading to the cessation of the taints. So here's the correspondence between the asavas and dukkha and suffering. When I knew and saw thus, my mind was liberated from the taint of sensual desire. So this is the uprooting of craving. So it comes very late in the practice, in the development. Craving is finally taken out of our experience as we achieve the state of being an arahant. From the taint of being. So being is, if you like, is becoming. It's bhava. It's the sense of identity that we create through the sense of self cultivated through the khandhas. And so this is, if you like, the uprooting of all of the things that give us a sense of me, mine, and my own. And from the taint of ignorance. And the ignorance here, ignorance always relates to the Four Noble Truths. And not seeing this clearly, dependent origination, and the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And so, having seen that the taint of being has been removed and the taint of craving, sensual desire, has been removed, then we remove ignorance, which is the identification with any of our senses and taking them personally. So this is the ultimate, if you like, uprooting the cause of our own suffering. When it was liberated, there came the knowledge it is liberated. So this is my mind. Well, the mind here, of course, is the chitta, the heart mind. I directly knew birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, and there is no more coming to any state of being. So there's no rebirthing of myself, not only from life to life, but from one moment to the next. This was the third true knowledge attained by me in the last watch of the night. Ignorance was banned and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. Suppose, bhikkhus, that in a wooded range there was a great low-lying marsh, near which a large herd of deer lived. Then a man appeared, desiring their ruin, their harm and bondage, and he closed off the safe and good path to be traveled joyfully, and he opened up a false path and put out a decoy and set up a dummy, so that the large herd of deer might later come upon calamity, disaster, and loss. So here we have the actions that seek to destroy the herd of deer. And one of the things I like in this description is that it's preventing these animals from finding the good path, which can be traveled joyfully. And so coming back to this idea of renunciation, or renunciation being a joyless place, the Buddha was very clear about this. No, this is a joyful route. But another man came desiring this herd of deer's good, welfare, and protection, and he opened the safe and good path that led to their happiness. And he closed off the false path, and he removed the decoy and destroyed the dummy, so that the large herd of deer might later come to growth, increase, and fulfillment. Bhikkhus, I have given this simile in order to convey a meaning. This is the meaning. The great low-lying marsh is a term for sensual pleasures. The large herd of deer is a term for beings. The man desiring their ruin, harm, and bondage is the term for Mara, the evil one. And Mara, we need to remember, is just like renunciation. It's not about suppressing and denying pleasure. Mara represents the wanting of more and more and more pleasure. And Mara is able to operate when we take things personally. That's his field of operation. As soon as we take things personally, we open ourselves up to being influenced by Mara. But as soon as we take personal identity out, and that's the craving, as soon as we release from craving, Mara cannot operate. So, the man desiring their ruin, harm, and bondage is a term for Mara, the evil one. The false path is a term for the wrong eightfold path. That is wrong view, wrong intention, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong concentration. I think this is a very helpful phrase because it identifies that there is nothing about mindfulness itself which propagates us along the path, because we can be wrongfully mindful. Mindful is amoral. It's not good, it's not bad, it's simply amoral. We can use it just like we can use a screwdriver screwing screws, but we could use a screwdriver to stab someone. The screwdriver hasn't changed, but the intention behind its use has changed. And what's important is to recognize that we need a clarity of intention behind our mindfulness for it to take us down the right path, not the wrong path. Similarly, concentration. There can be wrong concentration and there can be right concentration. The decoy is a term for delight and lust. The dummy is a term for ignorance. The man desiring their good, welfare, and protection is a term for the Tathagata, the Buddha. Accomplished and fully enlightened. The safe and good path to be traveled joyfully is a term for the noble eightfold path. That is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So, bhikkhus, the safe and good path to be traveled joyfully has been reopened by me. The wrong path has been closed off, the decoy removed, and the dummy destroyed. What should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and compassion for them, and has compassion for them, that I have done for you. These are the roots of trees, these empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus. Do not delay, or else you will regret it later. This is our instruction to you. That is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So that's the end of Majjhima Nikaya 19, two kinds of thoughts. So I'd just like you to just sit for a moment. Gently ground, feel the sense of contact with the ground. Soften in your hips and lower back. Allow there to be space here. Relax your shoulders, let your spine lengthen out. Relax any holding, embracing around your brain, and softly smile. Connect to the feeling of loving kindness. If you're working with the 6 directions, then continue to work with that. If you're working with your spiritual friend, just bring, first of all, a recollection for your own welfare and happiness. May I be well, may I be joyful, may I be happy. And allow that feeling of joyfulness and happiness to be present in you. Drop the memory, simply stay with the experience. Come back into the sensation of contact with the ground and your breath. Take a deliberate breath in and out, and softly open your eyes. Okay, so any questions you'd like to ask from the sutta or aspects of practice? Paul, you've just asked what was the Angutta Nikaya reference. That's in the Book of the Fives, and it's Sutta 200. See if I'm on the same page. If you've got the Bhikkhu Bodhi translation, it's on page 816. Just wait a couple of minutes to see if you've got anything else you'd like to ask.
Hello, you.
Yes.
Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yesterday, what we have did was the topic, since it was already mentioned, MN 18. We have yesterday read already once again. Yesterday we have read MN 19. Myself and Sindhu, both we read each para by para. It's a very good sutta, like we should go towards wholesome, not towards unwholesome way.
Yep.
It's the main aim of, like, intention of this sutta, I feel.
Absolutely. It's everything here is, we can think of renunciation as simply moving from the unwholesome towards the wholesome. We don't have to, if you like, construct whole formulations around what renunciation means. We can keep it pretty much to the idea of right effort. If we can recognize right effort as moving us from the unwholesome to the wholesome, and look in the whole raft of our personal experience in that way, then we're already acting in the way that the Buddha was describing renunciation as being helpful.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. Thank you for the question. Anything
Yes,
else anyone would like to ask? Okay, so I have a question here from Paul. Let me just read that out. The two cowherd sections, one is diligent, ardent, and resolute, and the other just observes how to get from one to the other. Well, the diligence, ardence, and resolution does not change, but the focus of it changes. So initially, we're looking at seeing how the mind is getting caught up in sensual pleasures or ill will or cruelty. But as we then begin to move through the jhanas, we move away from those aspects. We've developed the loving kindness, that's the counterbalance to ill will. We've developed compassion, which is the counterbalance to cruelty. And the sensual pleasures drop away, if you like, with the moving from being very aware of the body to the arupa jhanas, where the sensation of the body has dropped away. We're still engaged with one of the senses, which is the mind, but we're gradually refining that as we move our way through. So it's a progression of successive refinement. So the same diligence is there, the same being ardent, the energy that we need to put in place, but we need to balance that energy carefully. And the resolution, yes, we're still resolute in our intention. So we need to have a clarity of intention around the resolution. And we still need this collectedness. This is the diligence. And all of that needs to be supported by mindfulness. But it's a refinement. So gradually, as we move through the states of jhana, for instance, what we're looking at is a greater and greater refinement of the nature of the mind and how it works, how it gets caught up. And so eventually we get to the place where the cowherd simply knows what's going on. It doesn't have to be all the time getting attached to what the individual animals are doing, but just recognizing movements of mind when they occur and bringing them back into balance. So Bhante Ramsey often talked about the state of nothingness, for instance, being a place where we're simply fine-tuning energy. So the very softest of awareness, looking for slight movements of mind, looking for where we're putting too much effort in and where we're putting too little effort in. So this is, if you like, a refining of the balancing of the factors of enlightenment. And the factors of enlightenment are, if you like, a balance which is pivoted on mindfulness, and we have tranquility, and we have the collectedness and equanimity on one side, and we have joy, we have energy, and we have investigation on the other. And we have to balance these to ensure that we're moving through these states without an excess of one or the other. So I'm not sure, but let me know if that's said enough to answer your question. Okay, well, thank you. Any other questions?
The last question, can I ask?
Yes, of course.
So this is, I think, not related, directly connected to Dhamma. Like I work in construction industry where around 5,000 members of laborers work there. And in construction industry where I am working, sometimes accidents happens. Like after accident investigation, we will be finding that the accident has occurred because of unsafe conditions or unsafe acts by the laborers or the working condition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can we say the accident which they occurred, it is because of his past conditions?
We have to be careful about seeing karma as predestiny. If we see karma as predestiny, then we feel that we don't have any responsibility. And that then just leads us to an idea of fatalism, if you like. And what the Buddha always said is that we must take responsibility in the present for any of our responses and reactions. We can't simply drift along assuming that it's all predetermined. So the context in which something happens is manifold, and we can't say that the other people didn't have responsibility for what occurred. So if we simply assumed that or had the phrase, that's their karma, then no one would feel a sense of responsibility for their actions. If someone had neglected to do something, if someone hadn't assessed the proper risks of of how an accident might occur or what risks somebody might be exposed to, they're not taking responsibility. Similarly, if someone is acting carelessly and hasn't heeded the necessary safety, then they're acting carelessly. So for the individual who has the accident, the choices that they have is their, if you like, response to the accident. Something has occurred. Are they going to move into a place where they feel a huge amount of blame towards others, and they're resentful for it, and they're deeply unhappy because of maybe they've been seriously injured? Well, these would be understandable responses. But what the Buddha said is around pain, for instance, is that there are two darts. There are two darts with pain. Pain is the physical sensation, and then there's the mental reaction. And he said, there's nothing we can do about the physical sensation. That dart is present for everybody. But the second dart occurs when we have mental pain around what's happening. So we are all individually responsible for the degree of mental pain we create for ourselves. We aren't necessarily responsible for the accident that's occurred to us. That may be somebody else's responsibility. And so accountability is very important in that respect. But having had the accident, and whatever situation we're faced with, we then have a responsibility towards ourselves about how we respond to that, because we could end up creating additional dukkha for ourselves, which isn't the dukkha of the injury, but it's the dukkha of our mental response, which causes huge distress or additional distress. So we have the opportunity to work with the second dart, but not the first. The first is not under our control in that sense. So we can't just simply say, this was their karma, because it's a much more complex, there's a context in which all of that occurred. And so I think that's the best way for me to think of it, and it's my understanding of it, that we cannot absolve responsibility where it lies. Although we may choose to operate from a place of forgiveness for ourselves, and we might forgive other people for what's occurred, that doesn't mean that they're not held to account. And holding people to account can be very important. For instance, if we're to stop the same accident happening again.
Yes. Yes, sir.
All right. Does that help in some way?
Yes, yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Please, if anyone has any reflections on that or any other questions, please feel free to add your opinions and thoughts as well. Is there anything else anyone would like to add? If not, then I'll just bring up closing chant. Okay. So, may suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear struck
fearless be.
may the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings
be finally.
may all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired, the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and devas and nagas of mighty power
shade this merit of ours.
May they long protect
Buddha's dispensation.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. Thanking you all.
May you all be happy.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye now.
Bye.